I'm in the elevator. I'm hitting the button. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Tales from the Heart, a podcast from the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association. My studio looks a little bit different today because I'm visiting a friend in Chicago, and I am in his office or in his house. We're having trouble on Facebook, and we're having trouble someplace else, Ross. So maybe, let's see, where are we having problems? Both of the Facebook feeds are problematic this morning. So we're just going to be on LinkedIn, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, and we're not on Instagram, and X. So we will post this later on Facebook. So we're not going to have a ton of live participants because the majority of them come through our Facebook feed. So sorry, Facebook, you'll see us later. So today I am joined by Dr. Marty Maron, who is going to discuss with us today a little bit about our theme of the month, which is genetic therapy and understanding your family heart health history. And we're going to talk a little bit about a clinical trial that just read out and was featured in the main tent at the American College of Cardiology conference. Good morning, Marty.
Good morning, Lisa. Good morning, everybody tuning in too.
So how do you like my little friend over here, my big penguin?
Interesting. Yes.
It is interesting. It is an interesting backdrop, and we thank Brian for allowing me to borrow his house for the day. So let's start talking about the theme of the month.
Okay.
So where are we with genetic testing in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, April 12th, 2024?
Okay. That's a big question. Well, I think we can break it down or unpack it a little bit like this. I mean, I think one is that getting genetic testing is fairly easy to do today. I mean, there's a number of different companies that offer what we call commercially available genetic testing to test patients for the presence of a mutation that may be responsible for their HCM. So there's a panel, right? There's a genetic testing panel that the companies all offer, which is pretty similar, looking at, a number of different known mutations that cause that are associated with HCM. Okay? So, and that usually can be done with your cardiologist using either blood or even a buccal swab today to send off to test that material for one of the mutations. So getting genetic testing, the access to genetic testing, is pretty widely available today and is covered by most insurers. And if it's not, the out-of-pocket cost in general is pretty low today. So cost, although there may be some exceptions, is generally not prohibitive in terms of moving forward with genetic testing. So it's there, it can be done, and it's really fairly economically feasible. So the question then, I guess, is, why do it? What's the benefit? And I think that's probably where you're going here. What is the value in getting genetic testing? And I think we can kind of break that down into a couple of different buckets as well. Let's first start with the idea that if you take a large number of patients with HCM and you did genetic testing on them with the current panel that I just spoke about, the hit rate, meaning the percentage of patients that would come back with results that would identify their mutation, their disease-causing mutation, is between sort of 30 and 50% of patients, okay? So that means that about half of patients that have a diagnosis of HCM have no identifiable or clearly identifiable disease-causing mutation today, okay? That may be a number of different reasons why that's the case. We can come back to that, but that's why it's really important for patients to realize it's not 100%. It's not like you send it off and you're going to find your mutation 100% of the time. It's far from that. It's 50 or less percent. Okay. And so the value then maybe we can talk about sort of why do it. And I think that probably the strongest case to make for genetic testing, or one of the strongest cases to make, is that it can be helpful at determining if other family members are at risk or not of developing HCM in the future. Okay. So that if the patient in the family with HCM does genetic testing and it comes back positive, again, remember that happens only about 30 to 50% of the time. But if it does come back positive, then that opens the door, so to speak, to test other blood relatives, okay, including children, of course, of that patient, to see if they have the same mutation as the proband or the patient in the family. And the idea there is that if the other relatives in the family don't have the mutation, that's great. That's awesome. That's what everybody's hoping to see, because that means that those relatives, those family members did not receive the mutation and therefore are not going to be at risk of developing HCM and therefore do not need further screening testing in the future for that reason. So super helpful. On the flip side is that patients can get genetic testing, family members, and they can be identified as having the mutation. And usually what's happened before that is that they've had an echo or MRI that has shown that they don't have evidence, clinical evidence of disease with HCM. So their wall thicknesses are normal, but they get genetic testing in this strategy and they have the mutation. That's a scenario where that family member would be a carrier. They're genetically positive, but what we call phenotype negative, meaning they don't on echo or MRI show evidence of the disease. So they're a carrier of the mutation. And what that means is they're at greater risk in the future of developing HCM, but not 100%. Meaning that there are family members who carry the mutation who never develop disease their whole life. They remain a carrier. Okay. So that if a family member is identified then with having a mutation, we still, though, will continue to follow that patient with echo and other cardiovascular imaging testing to see if they do develop disease. Okay. So that's the genetic testing, what we call family cascade assessment using genetic testing. And I'll just mention one of the other areas where genetic testing is helpful too, and then we can open it up to discussion, is that there can be some patients who look like they have HCM on imaging, but they actually have a disease that isn't HCM, but something that mimics HCM. Okay, we've talked about that on other podcasts, what we call phenocopies, mimickers of HCM. Those are other cardiac diseases like amyloidosis or Anderson-Fabry disease or Danon disease, much less common than HCM. And again, they look like HCM on the echo sometimes, but are not. And they have different treatments and they have different natural histories. And so it's really important to make the diagnosis of those other diseases. And one way we can do that very reliably is with genetic testing, because those mutations that cause those other diseases are part of the same genetic testing panel as HCM. So let me cover a lot of ground there. Let's stop.
That was a lot.
Yeah. Let me stop talking and open it up to discussion. But that's a sort of a 10,000 view of genetic testing in HCM today.
So we know that about half of patients who get gene testing will find a causative mutation, and half won't. Yeah. But it is still very, very valuable to know if you have an identifiable gene in your family. And you brought up the mimickers. I just came from an advisory board for the very rare disease, Danon's disease, which looks like HCM. And a lot of these people think they have HCM and Danon's disease. It is a very different disease process. And to know you don't have the ultra rares, you don't have amyloidosis, you don't have Fabry's disease. These are good things to know you don't have. And if you do have them, there are specific treatments and investigational work being done on many of these. And you may have a whole different treatment pathway. And if you have a different treatment pathway, that's good to know. And it's good to know what to tell the rest of your family the disease state is that's in your family. Right. Not all thick hearts are HCM, but most thick hearts these days are getting referred to an HCM center for evaluation. So it's really important that you understand the root cause of your HCM. And genetic testing is easier than ever. It's cheaper than ever. There are some companies now offering a broader genetic test, looking at your exome and getting more data, which is a little confusing at this point, but I think someday it may clarify itself to a certain degree. But we are in a genetic age. We've got gene therapies coming, not only for myosin binding protein C. There's some early work in the troponin I group and the BAG gene, which BAG is really, really uncommon. I'm really curious as to why they picked that one, but I don't know what trials are going to look like there because there's not many patients. But the good news is we're doing clinical trials in gene therapies and people are interested. And I don't think it's going to be the answer for the majority, but for some families who have been hit particularly hard with the disease, I think it might offer an option that was never available before. So we're waiting to learn more. We all know the first 2 patients have been dosed with myosin binding protein C gene therapy. It's going to be a while before we know anything. Don't get excited about I'm going to wait for that before I do anything with my HCM. Please don't do that. It may be a really, 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 really long time, or it may never be clinically available. So please don't wait to get assessed because you're waiting for a cure through gene therapy. It's a long, long ways off. I've had a couple people say, oh, well, I'll just wait for that. I don't think that's a good strategy at the moment. So we've kind of handled gene therapy or genetic testing from a lot of different angles over many different podcasts and webinars. So I'm going to save some time today to talk about late breaking news that just came out of ACC, which was earlier this week. I'm still wearing the same clothes from ACC because I didn't pack a lot with me. I even have my sparkly sneakers on today, Marty. So I'm still on the road tour. So let's talk about you in the main stage, the big tent for ACC and the Imbria study. Many of the members of the HCMA did do the amazing task of volunteer for a clinical trial. And what did we learn?
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up. And as you said, this was what I'm going to talk about was a major effort among a lot of the different, HCM centers that contributed to this work. And the study itself was called Improve HCM. And it was looking at a new drug treatment for HCM. Okay. And the drug that was being looked at in this phase 2 study, phase 2, remember, is early, kind of one of the earlier stage assessments of therapy. There's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So phase 2 is usually in human with disease, and you're kind of looking at, the emphasis is largely on, safety and tolerability, although you are looking at some endpoints that reflect efficacy. So this was a phase 2 study looking at a drug called niraparib, which is made by a small pharmaceutical company in the Boston area called Imbria. That's the name of the company. And the drug niraparib is part of a class of drugs that are called mitotropes, depending on how you say it, that are, a mitotrope is a class of drugs that alter cardiac energetics, the energy of the heart. Okay. And so to kind of give a little bit of background so that you can understand sort of why this drug was looked at in HCM, let's just give a few minutes about background here. In HCM, we've known for a long time that one of the primary abnormalities is that there's actually an energy deficiency in the heart muscle. Okay. And the energy of the heart is something called ATP. ATP. You may remember that from high school biology. ATP. That's the energy source that the heart runs on to do all the kinds of things that it does: contract, relax, everything. Okay. And so one of the observations that we've known for a long time is that there's low levels of energy in the HCM heart. Okay. And why that's important is that one of the phases of the heart, the diastole, the relaxation phase of the heart, right, where blood is filling before it's pumped out, is really dependent on energy. It's a heavily energy dependent process. So that may seem kind of passive, to relax, but actually it takes a lot of energy to relax the heart. Okay. And if you've got an energy deficiency to begin with, then that impairs even more the ability of an HCM heart to relax well. Okay. And that's important because in HCM, in particular, with exertion, if you don't relax the heart, if the heart's not relaxing well, then it's not filling well with blood, and you're not getting the appropriate cardiac output that you need, particularly with exertion. And that's one of the things that leads to why patients get shorter breath, tired, and have a kind of a decrease in exertional capacity, exercise capacity. Okay. So with that said, then the idea here was to evaluate whether this drug, niraparib, and the way it works, niraparib, the way it works is that it acts in the heart to shift the heart's energy utilization. So it just alters how the heart chooses its energy source, and it shifts it to glucose, actually, which is much more energy efficient source of energy. Okay, as opposed to what is normally used in HCM hearts, which are kind of what we call free fatty acids. Okay, so not to get too technical, but the drug we're talking about works in the heart to shift the heart's choice of energy source to glucose, which is just more able to provide more ATP, more energy than the other source. Okay. And so the idea then would be that if you do that, you will improve how the heart relaxes, and you'll be able to make patients feel better and function better with exercise. Okay.
Good theory. Did it work? What do we know?
So what we found was in this phase 2 study was that niraparib, first of all, was actually very well tolerated. That was the primary issue, was looking at the primary aim, I should say, is that making sure it was safe, very safe in patients with HCM. So that's great. In fact, and also one other point about that, it didn't impact the heart pump function at all. Okay, so that differentiates it a little bit from the myosin inhibitors, which one of their challenges can be that they decrease heart pump function too much in some patients. The niraparib had no effect on that, okay, and otherwise was pretty well tolerated. And then in terms of what we saw with respect to efficacy, we showed that it did improve exercise capacity in non-obstructive patients. And I want to make clear that this study with niraparib was in non-obstructive patients. I thought I mentioned that, but because I didn't, we're talking about non-obstructive patients. The niraparib actually improved how non-obstructive HCM patients did with exercise, as measured with a objective exercise test called a cardiopulmonary exercise test, CPET. And so one parameter that we look at there improved significantly compared to non-obstructive patients that were on regular beta blocker or calcium channel blocker and placebo. Okay. And then the other thing is that for patients that felt poor at baseline before the study even began, meaning their symptoms were pretty significant, the niraparib actually improved significantly how patients felt at the end of the 12-week treatment period, okay, compared to if they were just on regular beta blocker or calcium channel blocker therapy. The way we measured how patients felt was using that questionnaire called KCCQ, Kansas City Heart Failure Questionnaire. So they got significant improvement based on that metric at the end of what a pretty short period of time, just 12 weeks of treatment. Okay.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. And so, I think that to summarize then, I mean, that, what we saw essentially was safe to use and a pretty good preliminary kind of signal from the study that this drug in non-obstructive HCM patients may have impact on how patients feel and how they're functioning. Yep. And so because of that, and then we can discuss discuss this more, is that essentially what that means then in practical terms is that created a lot of enthusiasm to go on to further characterize in kind of a larger population of non-obstructive patients in a broader way the efficacy with a bigger study, which is a phase 3 study for which we are moving in the direction of starting. Okay, so there's a lot of enthusiasm to do that, and it looks like that there are plans for a phase 3 with the niraparib and non-obstructive HCM. So we're going to be hearing more soon about that.
We are, and I've already gotten a couple of questions, and I got some answers while meeting with the leadership of Imbria at ACC, and that is, I think this is going to be a little bit disappointing for some people who were in the phase 2. Unfortunately, they will not qualify for the phase 3 because they need to show the drug in a certain number of individuals. And it does not look like those who were in phase 2 are going to be eligible for phase 3. So sorry, guys, you got to wait a little bit longer. But for the non-obstructed patient who is frustrated with symptoms, and might be a good time to start looking at clinical trials for the non-obstructed population. And the one thing I was taken by with the phase 2 is there didn't really seem to be any negative side effects during that. It was a small period of time, but the improvements seemed quite interesting. And the concept of shifting energetics from one energy source to another kind of made sense to a lot of these people, and they felt better. So I think it's a really exciting time for HCM. Not only are we fighting, to understand myosin inhibitors better, and yes, we have gene therapy on the horizon, but there are other drugs, not only the Imbria drug and an energetics drug, but there's going to be another clinical trial coming up with a compound that's an SGLT1, SGLT2 inhibitor, which is going to be an interesting study that's going to look for both non-obstructed and obstructed patients. And it can be on top of myosin inhibitors, beta blockers, calcium channel blockers. So there's going to be a whole bunch of new clinical trials coming up, which means, ladies and gentlemen, if you have HCM, this is the time to look at all of your clinical trial opportunities. And there's going to be a number of them. And you need to really start talking to your clinicians about which ones might make the most sense for patients like you, because you're all a little bit different. Marty, what should patients know about clinical trial landscape 2024? There's a lot of noise out here. It's all good noise, but how do they separate the noise into figuring out which might be the right path for them in a clinical trial at this point? Anything that they should be talking to their clinicians about or thinking about?
Well, I think that the first question is that, are they non-obstructed or obstructed? That's a first division point to determine whether, they may be candidates for current trials, because that bears on that, that can bear on that question. And then two is, I think there's a lot of, patients have to sort of understand, all that's involved in a clinical trial. It's a big decision, right? I mean, you're committing to, what is an investigational therapy, for which we may not have a lot of info sometimes about safety and efficacy. And also there's a commitment, to be in a trial like that. There's a big commitment to, in terms of often visits and returning for visits and being compliant with all that, super important. And so there's a lot of aspects to these trials that, I think that are best probably, discussed with your HCM cardiologist, so that you can really have the appropriate kind of detailed conversation around are you a candidate for any clinical trials based on your clinical profile, and two, if so, which ones those are and what those look like and whether they're a good fit for you for all these other issues. And so it's a big question, and I think overall, I think that's one kind of question that's best discussed with your local cardiologist, to help you understand. which may be the most applicable. I do want to make one point. Just I think you said this, but I think it's really important to again say that the gene therapy initiative in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is really just beginning, and we, right? I mean, and it's a very complicated initiative. Okay, it's different, and I think we've said this before on podcasts, but I think again, just in case people are listening that hadn't heard that before, it's different than the drug trial clinical trials, which move at probably a different pace and cadence and output than the gene therapy trials will or can. So again, I just want to make sure that the expectations here are centered, because it's going to, no matter what, take a fair amount of time. We're talking about years to really understand whether there is benefit, and then so in whom, and what that benefit looks like with gene therapy here. It's not around the corner at all. So as you just said, don't, that what that means is, I think it's probably prudent not to, it's prudent not to wait because you think that gene therapy is going to be accessible soon. That would not be an appropriate perspective. So I think we just got to keep that kind of thing in check a little bit here. And then two is that I forgot what my second thought was, but I think that's really important, because we don't want to give the false perception that we're looking at a cure around the corner. Okay, because that's not the case.
We have so much to learn about gene therapy, not just in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but in many other disease states. The Dannon's project is moving forward. It's looking promising, but it's slow. The Duchenne's muscular dystrophy data, the sickle cell data, the cystic fibrosis data. We're learning from all these other fields, and it's going to take time to figure this out. I do think it's a worthy initiative to figure out, and I am hopeful that someday we will put all the pieces of the puzzle together and have an option for people. Yeah. But I've heard a few people saying that they don't want to do the other drug trials because they just want to wait for it to be cured. I'm like, well, that would be nice, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Right. So why don't you feel better now, and maybe we have something later.
Exactly. And also the other point
that would be what I'm thinking about right now.
I agree. And the other point that I was going to say that I'd forgotten but now remember is that, I think one of the things that we're starting to talk about now that we've got these different drug therapies that are kind of emerging is that, it's more likely than not that treatment will look like there'll be, what we call dual therapy. It's not going to just be probably one. It may not just be one therapy, one pill, and then that's it. It may be actually a combination of therapies which attack, so to speak, HCM in different ways. Okay. And it's really good. And I'm saying that because it's really good to see with this Imbria HCM study, a drug that is addressing a different aspect of the mechanism of HCM than myosin inhibitors. And therefore you could imagine potentially in the future, kind of a complementary approach to drug therapy in HCM. Another thing to look out for.
I think, well, we've always used we've used a combination of drugs for a long period of time, whether it's a beta, an antiarrhythmic, or calcium channel blocker and a beta blocker. We've used a combination of drugs. I'm sorry if you guys are getting like some blippy internet on me here. My internet is not as sound as it normally is, so my apologies if I break up a little. But we do need to think about compound therapy, and it's not going to be one answer for everybody. So don't worry if you're not optimized in your health yet. There's some other things coming, and don't be afraid to talk to your team about multiple drugs. Now, you can't be in 2 clinical trials at once, so you'd have to pick a clinical trial that fits you best, or wait for a new drug to be made available. But don't be afraid to try. And I went through a whole bunch of different therapies as I had HCM, one beta blocker to another, add a calcium channel blocker, drop a calcium channel blocker, add a diuretic. There's all of these different things that could work, and finding the right cocktail is still going to take some time, and it's going to be very personalized and individualized, and that's okay. Working with a high volume specialist is going to help find that right cocktail for you, because the mechanisms in HCM are a little different than other forms of heart disease. And we're not garden variety heart failure. We are HCM. So, Marty, what else did you see at ACC that you thought was interesting?
Well, I thought that there were, one other area which I thought was getting a lot of attention is the emergence and beginning to apply AI, artificial intelligence, to certain aspects of specifically HCM, right? And so what I mean is the ability to apply and leverage this new science of artificial intelligence or machine learning, very computational and sophisticated, but applying it to certain aspects of testing in HCM to try to understand better what those results may really mean. And so I think there was a lot of focus on that in terms of preliminary abstract at ACC. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? You're breaking up.
Unfortunately, my internet is not behaving here. I'm back now. Hi. Sorry about that. I thought I had good internet here.
You're breaking up still.
Chicago internet is not New Jersey internet. That's all I got to say right now. If you can hear me. Let me check with Ross on the back end. Am I back? Okay. Sorry about that, Marty. Can you hear me now?
You're kind of in and out a little bit and slow, but
I think you're doing just fine. So why don't you just keep talking? Ross, can you help him out a little?
So I was just going to just give one example of what we were just talking about in terms of AI, and what I mean by that is, so for example, there's a lot of work going into analyzing just your basic 12-lead electrocardiogram, the EKG that comes out of the machine, and analyzing that instead of with human eyes, but with artificial intelligence. And what we're learning is that artificial intelligence can kind of see things in the EKG signal that humans may not be able to see or appreciate, and that may help us in terms of raising a red flag, for example, about a patient having HCM that doesn't have a diagnosis. So in helping to improve diagnosis based on just the 12-lead EKG, for example. Okay, so patient comes into the emergency room for a nosebleed and gets an EKG done because that's just one of the tests that gets done. And that EKG gets analyzed through one of these newer artificial intelligence programs. And then it says artificial intelligence program. The patient, you need to have an echo because, we're seeing something in the EKG that suggests HCM. So it's kind of amazing. And that may help lead to earlier diagnosis. And then that may ultimately, obviously, impact care for certain patients with HCM. And so that's a really interesting and exciting area, is the application of this new science to HCM. Right now, it's mostly in the form of analyzing EKGs and imaging tests in that kind of capacity. And I think we're going to see a lot more in the future about that and its impact on care.
I'm hoping you can hear me. It's not the best internet. Yeah. AI technology is absolutely astounding today. I'm happy to say that HCMA is joining into a partnership with a new sponsor at Viz.ai, and you'll be hearing more about them very soon. Hi, Doug. Patient transitioning from occasional AFib to more persistent. What's on the horizon? What's the appropriate time frame for attempted cardioversions? So, Doug, we've talked a lot about AFib. We did a real big deep dive into arrhythmias last month. So I would encourage you to go back and look at some of the tales from the heart from last month. But Marty, just to jump away from AI for a quick second to address a question from the audience, HCM, AFib, aggressive management so that we stop it is, I know what we pretty much talk about all the time, but how long should somebody stay in AFib before they try a cardioversion? I think is really the question. I think that's a very individualized question.
Yeah.
So if we could speak in generalities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, we're moving more toward, I think in a situation that I'm hearing about for that patient, we're moving generally more toward ablation therapy to help restore regular rhythm, but help to prevent recurrences. And I think the idea there is that the earlier that that's done, I think the likelihood is we're going to have more success down the line in keeping a patient like that in regular rhythm. And so, that's something that I think I would explore, hearing the story for that patient.
Wonderful. Thanks, Doug, for the question. I'm sorry about the internet issues that I'm having today, but I do want to just take a moment to go back to the AI issue. There's so much happening in AI right now. It's very promising. It's early days. We hope to use it to be able to identify the undiagnosed with HCM and help patients get to their HCM diagnosis much more efficiently in the future. There's going to be some pilot projects around the country. There's going to be some new data presented over the next couple of months and years on how we might be able to actually take all this big data stuff and put it to use for the patients in a very meaningful way. So we're super excited about finding new pathways to early diagnosis so that we can help more patients faster. There's a lot going on in the HCM community right now, lots of trials, lots of new technology. I did actually stop and meet with, it was a hallway conversation with the founder of KardioMobile, or Alive Core. Some of you may know that name. And he's got an AI API app that'll be available that we might be able to start doing some work to help you organize your HCM data a little bit more efficiently. So you can have one heart home for your HCM data as you travel around, and a place in a repository for you to store some of those tracings and see how things are advancing. So we're talking about some really interesting concepts. It's all going to be worked out eventually as to how we'll actually operationalize all this. But it is super exciting to be in HCM today. I could not believe the number of sessions and posters and interested industry members who are interested in HCM. We did get a last session meeting in as well. I felt like it was the old days in that last session, Marty, where we were on a far hallway. But generally speaking, we were main tent, front and center, everywhere. So any other thoughts on ACC?
Well, I'll just say that, particularly for those that contributed to the phase 3 Sequoia HCM aficamten study, those data, the results of the study, are going to be presented next month, in Europe, at a meeting in Europe. And so we're going to have the opportunity to really understand all of that data about the next generation myosin inhibitor aficamten, in terms of what it looks like with respect to the efficacy of it and the safety. And I think that's going to be a really exciting time as well. So there's a ton coming up here, particularly related to the newer myosin inhibitor aficamten within the next couple of weeks.
I'm still trying to figure out whether I want to go to Lisbon or not.
You should.
I know. I'm looking at my calendar. I have so many things to do in May and a baby coming. And I'm like, I don't know. Where can I go? So I might go to Lisbon. I might pop in.
It's going to be a transformative time for HCM again. I think that this data will be very, very impactful. So you should try to get it in for sure.
Okay. I'll go to Lisbon. I got to go figure out how much it's going to cost me to go to Lisbon. But I want to go to Lisbon. I want to be there. It's going to be a really pivotal time in HCM, as you said. And I always like to kind of go back and figure out how we got to where we are. And we didn't start HCM research. We didn't start any of this. The baton gets handed generation to generation.
Yep.
And what we were handed was such amazingly concrete science that we had this leverage to jump off to. And props to, all of those who did the early research, your dad, Jamil Tajik, Pravin Shah, Doug Weigel, all these luminaries, Eugene Braunwald, duh. Right. But all of these people who did this base research that now we are just blowing up and expanding and making it accessible to more patients. It's a pretty incredible thing to have witnessed as somebody who really gets off on cardiac history.
Yep.
We've evolved so much. So big thanks to all of them.
Yep.
I'm going to give you back a few minutes of your day. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I didn't expect to have technical difficulties at the 33rd floor in a building in Chicago.
Well, thanks for joining. I know you're in the middle of a lot of things there, and you just got done with ACC. So nevertheless, great effort.
Yeah, so this morning, the reason I was like running in here late is I went to see an old friend. His name is Dr. Stuart Berger. He is currently I believe the chief of pediatric cardiology at Laurie's Children's Hospital here in Chicago. And I had the opportunity to meet with him for a quick coffee and a little conversation and to catch up after a few years.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited to start doing some amazing projects with him. He is the founder of Project Atom, which is a CPR AED preparedness organization. And HCMA is looking really forward to partnering with Project Atom and with Dr. Berger specifically to really help elevate pediatric cardiology knowledge in HCM. Pediatric cardiology is a little different in HCM. They kind of lump us all into LVH, and there's lots of different syndromes and things that can occur in children that look like HCM, but it's not sarcomeric HCM. It's different. So having really strong partners on the pediatric side is critically important. And I was really happy to reconnect with an old friend who sends his love and respect to your dad.
That's great. That's great. Well, he's a legend too. So that's great. I'm glad you were able to do that. That's awesome.
That is. Okay. And we have some board news to update everybody on, but I haven't spoken to that person yet. So we have a new addition to our board of directors, which we will be announcing in the next couple of days. She is a real power in the pharmaceutical industry, and I am really excited to announce her soon, but I haven't spoken to her yet. So I think we should probably talk to her and make it official with her and then tell the rest of the world. So super excited to add more knowledge and experience to the board so that we can do bigger and better things for all of you out there. Yeah. All right. So stay tuned for that announcement. Awesome. It's going to be a big one. Marty, thanks for the day. Ross, thanks for starting things up here. Sorry to the Facebook people who couldn't watch this live, but we'll get it over to you later. So I'm off to my next meeting.
All right. Safe travels. Talk to you soon.
Marty.
Thank you.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.